Dan had mentioned, I had spent some time in the Antarctic as an undergraduate, most of a year on the first expedition, and then about 6 months on the second expedition doing biological research. And it was during my long, cold winter in Antarctica that I read several printed accounts about the Scott expedition, and it raised questions. And I came away with more questions and have spent the last 45 years searching for answers, and found some interesting things that I'll share with you this morning. At least I hope you find them interesting, as I compared Scott's handwritten journals, the ones he wrote while freezing in a tent, to what was published as his actual journals with no edits. And I think it illuminates the story in a little different light. So 2 men raced to the Antarctic to be first at the South Pole in 1911. One of them got there first. That was the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, and he came back with all of his men. Scott got there second, died in the attempt, and yet is portrayed as the hero. And my question was basically, well, how did that happen? And if Scott had such a horrible trip, how was it that Amundsen was there at the same time and didn't have a horrible trip? And what was portrayed? And this got into issues of non-disclosure agreements. It got into contracts of press involving press syndicates. And it got into the British Empire wanting to maintain its international prominence as the preeminent empire against an upstart nation called Norway that had only been independent for 5 years, and yet in the race to the pole, the Norwegian won and the Englishman didn't. So let me see if I can touch the right buttons, and we'll begin. Hold questions, please, till the end, and I'm glad to answer any of them, and I'll hang on as long as people want to talk about stuff. So, is that working?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in 1911, one became the hero, the other one was first. Robert Scott, the Englishman, was age 43, and Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, at age 39. Wait a minute. Okay, this way. For those of you who are not familiar with the Antarctic, just a little bit of a lesson in geography. It is a continent surrounded by oceans. It's 5.5 million square miles, which means it's larger than Europe is. The continent is split by a mountain chain called the Transantarctic Mountains, and it sits about 2,000 miles south of New Zealand. South America is here, Africa is up here, and Australia is here. The South Pole sits here at an elevation of 9,300 feet, and it sits on the polar plateau, which at its thickest is 3 miles of ice. South Pole itself is sits on 12,000 feet of ice. In 1840, an English sea captain named Robert Ross came south this way, James Clark Robert Ross, and sailed through the pack ice, which is only accessible for a few weeks in the summer. It's the only time it breaks up. Sailed along the coast and into a sea that he named after himself, and got to this corner of Antarctica where he found a volcanic island, and he named it Ross Island. He also encountered a 200-foot cliff of ice, which he called the ice barrier, and sailed along it for some 500 miles to another spot that he named the Bay of Whales because of the number of whales that he saw there. And said, wow, if anybody's going to get to the South Pole, which he was trying to reach, they're going to have to somehow get on the ice barrier and march to the pole that way. That was in 1840. This is what the barrier looks like today. This is a helicopter for size comparison. And as Ross sailed south, he wrote, well, there's no more chance of sailing through the barrier than there would be through the cliffs of Dover, because the ice cliffs that he encountered were up to 200 feet high. The average ice thickness on the barrier is about 1,100 feet. It's the size of Spain, because everything in Antarctica is larger than you could ever imagine. And it covers the southern half of the Ross Sea, but it does provide a flat ice-covered surface all the way south to about 450 miles from the pole. From Ross's notes, Scott in 1901 to 1904 launched an expedition, the first major British expedition after Ross was there, down to Ross Island, because Ross had written the barrier is really only accessible at 2 points. One is here, and the other is in the Bay of Whales, possibly if you could get up it. And so Scott came here in 1901, and with his friend, Dr. Wilson, and Ernest Shackleton, They became the first 3 men to go on the ice shelf itself. They got within about 500 miles of the pole, started to run out of fuel and food, raced back, and barely made it alive back to their base camp at Ross Island, suffering from scurvy. Shackleton, who was part of that group, came back in 1907. This time he brought with him Manchurian ponies to pull loads of food and fuel across the barrier. And then with three companions, the 4 of them discovered the Beardmore Glacier, walked up the glacier for 125 miles from sea level at the barrier surface up to the polar plateau at 9,000 feet, and then to within 97 miles of the pole to claim the record as being the furthest south, again for England. 97 miles from the pole, they encountered bad weather, and Shackleton would write, "I'd rather be a live donkey than a dead lion. We're not going to make it to the pole." And they came back to Ross Island, barely making it as well. Again, suffering from scurvy and having run out of provisions. Well, that set the stage for the race in 1911, where Scott wanted to be the first to the South Pole and to claim it for Britain. He would again land at Ross Island and follow Shackleton's route to within 97 miles of the pole. At the same time, Amundsen is at the Bay of Whales, where Ross had written, "You might be able to get up here." And he's going to also launch his assault on the pole at the same time. Well, in 1909, Scott starts raising money for his expedition. And he says, "I don't hold that anyone but an Englishman should get to the pole first." And again, this is a time when Britain is at the height of empire. And Norway has only been a nation for 5 years. They were given their independence from Sweden about 5 years earlier. Amundsen has raised money to go to the North Pole. But the American Robert Peary has now claimed the North Pole. And so while at sea, Amundsen reverses course, and instead of going north, where he was supposed to go according to the funds that he had raised, he heads south and he sends a telegram that catches up with Scott. And the telegram reads, "Only beg leave to inform you, Fram," that's Amundsen's ship, "proceeding to Antarctica." And Scott has no idea where in Antarctica Amundsen plans to land, but clearly it's going to be a race. Now, there's some differences in the 2 expeditions. Amundsen takes a crew of 9 people that will spend the winter with him in Antarctica before they launch their assault at the pole the next year. Scott will have 31. Both men have got Antarctic experience. Amundsen was in Antarctica just before the turn of the century in 1897 to 1899 and was part of the first expedition to spend a winter in Antarctica. So he knows what to expect. He's also had vast experience in the Arctic. He's lived with the Eskimos. He was the first man to complete the Northwest Passage, doing it partly by ship and partly by dog sled. He knows how to work with dogs. He knows how to survive in the cold. He and some of the men that are with him were the first to cross the ice cap, the glaciers of Greenland. And so he's well skilled. Scott has been there before. He spent 3 years there in 1901 to 1904, first again to walk on the barrier. So he knows what to expect. When they launch their attacks on the pole to reach it first, Amundsen will take 5 men and 52 dogs. Scott will have 16 men, 14 dogs, 2 motor sledges, and 10 ponies. Quite a bit difference in the way they approach things. Another difference is in public relations, and Laurel, you might be interested in this. Amundsen's public relations were poorly organized, and he had very limited support. His brother is in Norway, and that really is his major contact. And they have a relationship with one newspaper that has bought the rights to Amundsen's story, and he also has a book contract, but that's it. Behind Scott on the public relations side is the great Royal Geographical Society. He has multiple corporate sponsors. In 1909, his fundraising was down to the level of individual schools and school children who would contribute their pence, their money, in order for Scott to buy a dog, or you could contribute towards a sleeping bag or a tent or a sled. And he's got a news syndicate behind him, a group called Central News. Everyone on Scott's expedition was required to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, which focused all of their records, their journals, and restricted them from speaking, except as it would come through one editor in London who would control the story and the spin. Quite a bit different. Okay. All of the maps you'll see, and there's only really this one, have the South Pole at the north or up, So don't get confused. Again, Scott has a known route to within 97 miles of the pole. This is all unknown, and Amundsen is here. The trick in the first year is to build depots of supplies out on the barrier because you cannot carry enough food and fuel to get you to the pole and back. That was proven on Scott's first expedition when they got to about here and then had to return by the skin of their teeth, not having enough food and fuel to make it the whole way. Amundsen built depots, Jeckelin built depots, and he was able to get within 97 miles of the pole. Scott in 1911 builds one depot. It's located here. Amundsen builds three at 80, 81, and 82 degrees. So Amundsen's chain of depots extend 150 miles beyond Scott's furthest depot. That gives him an advantage. These are what the depots look like, and the photos are all from presentations that were either given after the Scott expedition and then published, or presentations that Amundsen gave when he got back to civilization and was talking to the public. These are Amundsen's three depots. This is Scott's one depot, and in them, Scott has less than a ton of supplies. Most of that weight is in food for his horses, pony forage. Amundsen has got frozen seals, food for his dogs and his men, and he has 3 tons of supplies. That gives him a bit of an advantage. In 1974, when I was on the barrier, I could have taken pictures that were similar. The barrier looks like this. It is low overcast on the top, uniform whiteness on the bottom, and a thin line where the horizon is. This is Scott's depot, and it's marked by a single flag. Amundsen also marked his depots with a single flag, but he hedged his bets. Given his experience in the Arctic, he said, in case the weather closes in, we need a bigger target. So Amundsen, when they built a depot, would send his men 3 miles to the east, 3 miles to the west, and they would put flags at 500-meter intervals to mark the spot. The flags were all numbered, so they would know if they encountered a flag, whether they should go left or right, and how far it was to get to the food and the fuel. It's a little different approach than Scott's single flag that they hoped to find in a featureless landscape. I mentioned that Scott didn't know where Amundsen was, and that's true. Scott left to build his depots. Scott sent his ship along the barrier edge to the Bay of Whales, and lo and behold, there was the Fram and the Norwegians, and they met quite by accident. This is the Norwegian ship, Amundsen's ship, and a little piece of the barrier. Amundsen was able to get up it and built his hut there to start their expedition. This is Scott's ship called the Terra Nova. And when they met, the Norwegians said, hello, here we are, let's start the race. And by the way, why don't you come here for breakfast? So the Norwegians invited the British on the ship to come and see their station, their base at Framheim, home of the Fram, as Amundsen named it. And up on the ice, Norwegians had built tents for their dogs, and the tents are actually dug down into the ice. And they'd also built this heated hut so that they could spend the winter there. This is what it looked like inside the hut. This is Amundsen with all but one of his men. There was somebody taking the picture. All very busy, all very seasoned in the Arctic, and all very serious. What impressed the British were 3 things. First of all, Amundsen had 110 dogs. Secondly, he had seasoned men who knew how to travel in Arctic climates, and it translated well into the Antarctic. Third was the facility itself. This is from one of Amundsen's magic lantern shows that he gave to the public after he returned. This is the floor plan of the hut you just saw. The rest of this are all sub-ice tunnels, workshops, and storage rooms that the Norwegians built under the snow so that they could work in relative comfort all winter long and would only have to go outside to feed the dogs or exercise the dogs. By comparison, this is Scott's hut at Cape Evans. It's above ground, it's on rock, and all of their supplies are outside, which means every time they need something, they had to send men out into the Antarctic conditions of winter with shovels to dig out the supplies, find them, and drag them back in. Also in the photo, a couple of things I'll point out. One is some of the ponies, and the other is a professional cinematographer and photojournalist that was on the expedition to take pictures and make black and white movies and then bring them back after Scott's first year to give lectures and performances back in England in order to keep the money flowing because expeditions are expensive. All of Scott's horses, and he had 19 of them, Manchurian ponies, are white, because on the previous expedition of Shackleton, when he got within 97 miles of the pole, Shackleton had a collection of Manchurian ponies, but the last one to die was white. So Scott reasoned white ponies must have an advantage. And so he demanded that all 19 of his ponies be white, regardless of how old they were or what condition they were in. And so when they went to the market for horses in Vladivostok, there was a premium price that was then placed on white horses because they knew the English were looking for only white ones, and not all of them were very good. Indeed, in his depot trip, Scott takes 8 ponies out onto the depot to haul supplies. 6 of them die in the attempt, and only 2 make it back. They're not real successful either. This is Scott and the men that will spend the winter in this hut. And there's the 31 of them. Some other differences in 2 expeditions. The Norwegians are all dressed in furs from head to toe, and they've been very careful in their selection of furs. Scott's men are dressed in gabardine, in wool, in bayberry. They have a woolen boot that slips over their normal footwear, and they have, a fur boot that slips over their normal footwear, and they have fur mitts. They have scarves and hats. They don't have hoods. And this baffles everybody. I do not understand why they couldn't copy the Eskimos and wear hoods, but they don't. And these 3 guys, this is during their first winter, are about to go off and look for penguin eggs 70 miles away from the base at Cape Evans in order to collect them at an early stage of development. Emperor penguins lay their eggs in the winter. And the thinking of Dr. Wilson in the middle was that if they could collect penguin eggs at an early stage of development, they might be able to find a link between birds and reptiles. And so they leave to make a 70-mile trip in the middle of winter. It will take them 35 days, and they encounter temperatures of 60, 70, even 80 below zero, and wind speeds equivalent to a hurricane, 80, 90 mile an hour winds. They're gone for 35 days, dressed like this. I mentioned that Scott's going to use ponies. Now, there's 3 problems with ponies. First of all, they eat like horses. They eat a lot, which means you've got to carry a lot of forage for them, and only ponies eat pony forage. Secondly, they've got small hooves, so they sink deeply in the snow, they bog down, and sometimes they were as deep as their bellies in the snow. And then they sweat. And when they stop marching and they've sweated, they freeze and they shiver and they die, sometimes in harness. Scott will also take dogs, but he doesn't believe in dogs because of his earlier expedition in 1901. When they used dogs, they really didn't know how to work with them. They overloaded them, they underfed them, and the dogs died. So Scott believes the dogs cannot be depended on, and this baffles the Norwegians, who say that either the Englishmen neither bought bad dogs or they really don't know how to use them. And it's the latter that's true. They really don't know how to use their dogs. Scott also has motor sledges. And his number 2 in command, Lieutenant Evans, who's in charge of the motor sledges, writes that they were wretched failures. But this is really the first attempt at using something like that would become a snowmobile. One of them gets 30 miles from Scott's base camp before it breaks down entirely. The other one gets 50 miles. Scott had hoped that they would pull all the way across the barrier and to the base of the Beardmore Glacier and save them a lot of man hauling. They don't work out so well. They are wretched failures. Mostly Scott relies on men on skis pulling the sleds, which they move at a relatively slow pace. Well, Scott leaves his depot, comes back, and finally the ship returns to Cape Evans and says, guess what? We found Amundsen. And Amundsen's in the Bay of Whales. And the men who were with Scott at the time, when he read the note from the ship, said he went on a 90-minute tirade. He was screaming, he was shouting, he was stomping. One of the men who were with him said he even threatened to take a revolver, get on the ship, go to the Bay of Whales, and personally shoot Amundsen, because he feels that the Ross Ice Shelf is his, and no one should be attempting the pole. They're poaching on his home turf. He finally settles down, and this is his journal entry from that evening. This is one of the handwritten journals that still exists, although they're really hard to get a hold of. And he writes that Amundsen really is a serious menace to our plans, and our wiser course is to proceed exactly as if this had not happened. Remember those 2 things. Amundsen is a serious menace to Scott's plans, and that Scott's wiser course is to proceed exactly as if Amundsen weren't there. Because in the printed journals and in the newspaper reports, these two phrases are left out intentionally. Winter work at Scott's base was basically this. Scott sat down at his desk to write the detailed plan for how they would get to the pole. His men were busy with equipment, and bear with me a moment while I hit a different switch here. And some of his men were still doing science. He had glaciologists and geologists. Someone was studying the auroras, and he had a biologist who would go out onto the sea ice, chip a hole in the ice, and put down what amounts to a large minnow trap. In 1974, I was doing what these guys were doing, chipping holes in the sea ice, sending down a trap to sample biology, to sample fish and invertebrates at the bottom, and then hauling it back up. The only difference was that in 74, we used a winch, and in 1911, they were using 3 burly sailors to pull it up. It was cold and miserable then, and it was cold and miserable in 1974 too. I mentioned the trip to go collect penguin eggs, and the cinematographer, Herbert Ponting, took before and after pictures of men when they would go do things. So Dr. Wilson, age 39, is on the left, and Cherry Gerard, who was one of the younger members of the expedition, was on the right. And these are the photos that Herbert Ponting took as they were about to go off on that 35-day trip. This is what Wilson looked like when he came back from the barrier. This is what Cherry Gerard looked like when he came back from the barrier. Herbert Ponting had been in Manchuria covering the Russo-Japanese War and seen prisoners. He said, "The looks on their faces haunted me for days and reminded me of the prisoners that he had seen in Manchuria and in Siberia." Ponting also wrote that when they came back to Ross Island, to the base, we had to, quote, excavate them from their clothing because their clothing got iced up. Cherry Gerard's clothing weighed 25 more pounds than when he had left because of accumulated ice. His sleeping bag had 27 pounds of ice accumulated inside it. Can you imagine crawling into a sleeping bag with frozen clothing? There's 27 pounds of ice in your sleeping bag that you have to try to thaw before you can ever really try to sleep. And the temperature's minus 60 or minus 70. This is what they face. And their looks haunted me for days. Over at Framheim, winter work was going on in these sub-ice or sub-snow workshops, where it was relatively warm. Now, Amundsen had built his equipment in Norway, and he had built it based on the accounts of Scott from 1901 and also from Shackleton's reports in 1907. When they actually got to the barrier and took their equipment out, they said, wait a minute, conditions here are not any worse than they are in the Arctic. They're not as bad as Scott made out in his reports from 1901 or Shackleton from 1907. We've overbuilt our sleds. So they took apart their sleds and they took wood planes and they planed off and planed down the wood in their packing crates and their sleds to make them lighter and more flexible. They saved 110 pounds per sled by doing that. And they replaced the 110 pounds of wood with more food and fuel for their trip. Winter ends and Amundsen launches his attack on the pole, his bid for the pole, with 5 men and 52 dogs on the 20th of October in 1911. This is their sleds and dogs as they're about to depart from Framheim. 4 days later, Scott launches his attack at the pole with 16 men, 14 dogs, 2 motor sledges, and 10 ponies. On the 24th, 4 days after Amundsen leaves, Scott's motor sledges go forward. On November 1st, 10 ponies led by 10 men take off. And on November 5th, Scott launches his 2 dog sled teams. Why are the dog sleds going last? Because they move the fastest. And they're carrying food for the ponies that move the slowest. So although newspaper reports, journals, books, and reports of Scott's expedition will say that the reason Amundsen got to the pole first is that Scott left a month later, isn't quite true. Scott left on the 20th of October. Amundsen leaves on the 20th of October. Scott starts to leave on the 24th, and then on November 1st, his main assault goes in there. So they're in different months, but they're not a month apart. By November 30th, Amundsen has found a way across the barrier. It's all uncharted. He finds a new route. He encounters the mountains and he goes up the Axel Heiberg Glacier, which he's named after one of his donors, and reaches an altitude of 9,100 feet. His climb from sea level to the top of the Axel Heiberg Glacier happens in 35 miles. It's that steep. It's a 35-mile climb up a glacier. 2 weeks later, he's at the pole and he says, "So we arrived. Thank God." They're 928 miles from Framheim. They spend 3 days at the pole taking sightings. He has 4 qualified navigators with him so that they can nail the exact spot of the pole. Then they start taking what pictures they can. They're not very good photographers. The color photo that you see in the lower right is actually retouched after he got back here. He has someone, an artist, take watercolors and retouch the glass plates so they look like they're in color. They do bring the flag back, and the flag is in Norway now at the Fram Museum and is signed by the 5 members of his team that made it to the South Pole. Also at the pole, and this is Amundsen, he's very clever. He leaves a small tent that's extra and surplus to their needs. And in the tent, they place some equipment that they no longer need, including extra furs, a theodolite, the thing for measuring altitude. And he leaves a note, a letter for King Haakon VII of Norway saying, "We got here on such and such a date." And to that letter, he attaches a note for Scott saying, very graciously, "I think you'll be the next person here. If you are, please deliver this letter to King Haakon of Norway for me." Scott is going to be confused by this, but Amundsen has hedged his bets. If Amundsen doesn't make it back, he knows Scott's going to find the tent, Scott's going to find the letter, and Scott's going to know, as will King Haakon, that Amundsen got there first. So where is Scott at the same date? Well, Scott is 400 miles behind. He's still on the barrier at the lower end of the Beardmore Glacier. All 10 of his ponies are dead. The 2 dog teams have been sent back. And he's now down to 12 men in 3 tents as they begin their ascent up the Beardmore Glacier. Now, unlike the glacier that Amundsen went up, which was only 35 miles long, the Beardmore Glacier has a much more gentle slope, and it's 125 miles long from the top of the barrier up to the top of the plateau. Scott takes 12 men up to this location where they dump their excess supplies and create a depot for the trip back, and he sends 4 men back. 8 men go on to within 150 miles of the pole, and Scott splits his team at that point. He says, "I'm going to take 5 men to the pole, 3 of you will go back, and we'll dump our extra supplies in a new depot here." So 3 men head back. One of them is Scott's number 2 in command, Lieutenant Evans, who left just about a week before Scott did with the motor sledges that broke down. And Evans and his 3 men then head back, and Scott goes forward to the pole with his 5. Scott is racing at this point, but he's not racing Amundsen. Scott believes the Beardmore Glacier is the only way you can get up the plateau, and he has seen no indications of Amundsen to this point. But he's racing against Shackleton's record. Amundsen has taken a different route. Scott really doesn't know where he is, but he's not on the Beardmore and believes he's not going to make it up. But Scott is racing Shackleton, who still has the record for the furthest south. And Scott has been following Shackleton's route exactly, and he's been following his dates. When Scott gets 95 miles from the pole, he writes in very large letters in his journal, "I've got the record. I am beyond the record of Shackleton's exaggerated walk. He's beaten it by 2 miles, and he's done it in the same amount of time." The word exaggerated is edited out of the printed journals. It's only found in the handwritten journal. When Shackleton got 97 miles from the pole, it was January 9th. He had done it in the same amount of time. He was facing 40 below zero with gusts of 70 to 80 miles an hour. Scott has relatively mild weather at -4. And Shackleton writes, "We have shot our bolt. It isn't quite an exaggerated walk." So Scott goes on for a few more days. And on January 16, he writes, "The worst has happened. We found a black bamboo flag in the snow, flagpole in the snow with a little black flag at the top, ski tracks and many dog prints. He's now run across Amundsen's track." Amundsen didn't go up the Beardmore, he went up a different glacier, but then within 20 miles of the pole, Amundsen veers to a position where he knows Scott's track is going to come later and leaves a marker saying, "Hi, Scott, beat you." A couple of days later, Scott is at the pole. Scott is in the middle. He is here. Let's do it that way. This is Lieutenant Bowers, Dr. Wilson, who went to collect the penguin eggs, a sailor named Evans, who's no relation to Lieutenant Evans, who has already gone back, and Oates, who is the fourth member of their group. And Scott writes the pole, but under different circumstances than we expected. We've had a horrible day. Writes, "Great God, this is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored without the reward of priority. Still, it's something that we got here, and maybe the wind will be our friend tomorrow." Remember that, because what they want to do is erect a pole on the sled and use the wind to help push it. He also writes, "Now for the run home in a desperate struggle to get the news through first." This is how it is in handwriting. Ladies and gentlemen, all the printed versions of Scott's journals, this phrase, "to get the news through first," is edited out. And the meaning of what he writes then changes to, "Now for the run home in a desperate struggle, period. I wonder if we can do it." It's a much different tone than, "We need to get the news through first. I want to race back, and I know that Terra Nova, my ship, is faster than Amundsen's ship, and I only have to go to New Zealand to get the news through first, and then I can control the spin on the story." Well, at the pole, Scott finds the tent left by Amundsen, and he writes, "It looks like the Norwegian party expected colder weather," and that's because of the furs that Amundsen said they really didn't need. They had wolf skins, they had extra sleeping bags that were made out of furs, and they found it to be too warm to use them, so they left them there in the tent. And Scott writes, "It could be scarcely otherwise from Shackleton's overdrawn account of what the plateau was like when he was here." And then Scott writes, "We have turned our backs now on the goal of our ambition with sore feelings," another phrase that's edited out of the published versions. So they turn around and they head back. The note from Amundsen, Scott does fine, and he's puzzled by the object as to why he's going to be a postman. And the answer is quite clear. If Scott doesn't bring the letter back, Amundsen can say, "Well, you really didn't get there because we left the tent. You would have seen it." And so Scott becomes the postman who delivers, or will deliver, the letter back to the King of Norway. Scott looked around at the tent, and he finds the pole, which was an old sledge runner, that Amundsen left at their exact spot and location for the pole. And Scott ordered one of his men to go over and pull the thing out of the snow, remove the pole marker that Amundsen had left. They tie it to their sled, and they're going to put a piece of canvas on it to serve as a sail to push their sled along to make it a little easier for them. They follow their own tracks back, and Scott writes, "We follow these to the ominous black flag which first appraised us of our unwelcomed predecessors." Again, the word "unwelcomed" is edited out. And they took the sledge runner off their sled, the one that we're using as a mast, because it's kind of clunky, and they throw it down on the snow. And they pull out this marker that first alerted them that Amundsen had beat them. They tie it to the sled, and they're going to use that as a mast instead. And he writes, "So that is the last of the Norwegians for the present." But there's a little bit more to the story, and that's not quite true. Let me turn to Scott's sledging ration for a moment, because it enters our story here very quickly. This was his basic ration, and this is from one of the photographs at the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge. A little bit of cocoa, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of tea, 2 ounces of butter, pemmican, which is a ground meat mixed with animal fat and compressed into a loaf, and 16 ounces of biscuit made from highly refined flour. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what's missing from this? Vitamins. Scurvy. Some of the symptoms of scurvy: depression, joint pain. We all hear about bleeding gums and losing teeth, but it also can result in internal bleeding, cerebral edema, tachycardia, which is a heart condition, as well as exhaustion. Medical journals say that scurvy's symptoms begin to appear 70 to 100 days on a diet that does not include vitamin C. Well, in 1902, Scott, Wilson, and Shackleton had symptoms at 92 days. Shackleton actually collapses and has to be basically nursed back to within 60 miles of Ross Island, all the way back, being pulled by Wilson and Shackleton along the way. Shackleton comes back in 1909 after 117 days on the sledging ration. 2 of his men collapse, and he and another companion have to run 33 miles to Ross Island to summon help to save those 2 men. In 1912, on Scott's expedition, remember, Lieutenant Evans left from the top of the Beardmore Glacier, 150 miles from the pole, to go back with 3 men, and he's carrying dispatches, by the way, from Scott newspaper reports. And after 98 days, he and 1 other man of his men collapsed 36 miles again from Ross Island because of scurvy, and they have to be rescued. Well, February 1st is day 90 for Scott, and Scott is 500 miles from Ross Island at that point. At that point, his journal entries start to go from being optimistic, I'm going to get the news back first, to being very pessimistic, despondent again. Thank God we found our half-degree depot. Very critical situation. Can't find the depot, looking for the flag. Is the flag still standing? We're pulling for food. And then on the 17th of February, Sailor Evans, dies quietly at 12:30. He had fallen into a crevasse. He had a concussion and dies of a concussion. He's the first of the 5 to die. That's on February 17th. 25th of January, by the way, is the same date that Amundsen has already made it back to Framheim, and he's on his ship heading north. Entries for early March, 250 miles from Cape Evans. We've done only 5.5 miles today. Scott's plan required him to do 10 miles a day or they'd run out of food. They made a pace of 10 miles per day. They could make it from one depot to the next. Less than that, they'd have a problem. God help us, we can't keep pulling. Things are looking very black indeed. And no fuel means no water. They're running out of fuel. If you don't have fuel, you can't make water, you can't heat your meals, and you dehydrate. His fuel cans are leaking just as they did in 1901 and 1904. He never solved the problem of leaky fuel cans. Amundsen knew about leaks in fuel cans. He had seen it before in the Arctic and had designed things so that he didn't have that problem. Indeed, one of Amundsen's fuel cans is found in 1958, and it's still full. March 7th, a little worse. I fear one of Oates' feet very bad. Oates' feet had frozen at this point. Not just cold, they're solid blocks of ice. And as flesh warms after it's been frozen, it's excruciating. So they cut his sleeping bag so that he can leave his leg out and his feet can remain frozen. They do 6.5 miles in a day. And Scott writes, "We may get to the next depot, but not to 1-ton camp." He knows by March 7th, they're not going to make it. On March 7th, the same day, Amundsen pulls into Hobart, Tasmania with his ship. He goes ashore, runs to the telegraph station, and sends a telegram to his brother Leon in Norway saying, "Pole attained, all well." And then he asks about Scott, but there's no news of Scott's expedition. But Amundsen gathers up all the newspapers he can, and he runs back to his ship for 3 days because he's got to do 2 things. First, from the newspapers, he's got to determine whether he's in trouble, because he has defrauded his donors by saying he's going to go to the North Pole, and instead he went to the South Pole. And he's worried about a lawsuit or being arrested by the king. He's also writing his story for release to the papers. English is his second language, but he is his own publicity machine, and that's what he does over the next 3 days. On the 10th, he releases his news from Hobart, Tasmania, and if we ignore the headlines from the New York Times for a moment and read the substance of the story, there was little that was adventuresome about the trip. We marched 15 miles in 6 hours, then we'd sleep for 6 hours, and then we would march again. We had full rations the whole way. The British read this and they know from the dates that there's no way Scott got there first. They also know that they can now spin the story a little differently because there's no drama. There was little adventure. We had full rations the whole way and we had no problems. On the 16th of March, it's Oates' birthday. They're 170 miles from Cape Evans. Scott writes, "Have lost track of dates." Oates had asked to be left in a sleeping bag behind. They didn't do that. In the morning of the 17th, Oates wakes up and says, I'm going out and I may be some time and I'm not coming back. So he crawls out into the blizzard and sacrifices himself in the hope that the other three can move along a little faster. By the end of the month, they're 158 miles from Cape Evans. They're 11 miles from One Ton Depot. And Scott writes, we shall stick it out to the end, but the end can't be far. It seems a pity. I don't think we can write more. And his last entry, for God's sake, look after our people. They don't go any further. The next day, Scott's ship has gone north. They pull into New Zealand where they start cabling out his dispatches that he's given to each of the returning parties on his polar assault to say, here's where I am, here's what's going on. And the story becomes released over 3 days. The story that they don't know that Scott's dead yet. It's 150 miles from the pole. There's lots of story here. There's thrilling escapes, many perils. Party of 5 probably reached the pole. And oh, by the way, this whole trip hasn't been about getting to the pole. It's been about doing great science. They've begun to spin the story in a different direction because they know Amundsen is the pole and they don't. Also on the ship, when it went back to New Zealand, was the cinematographer Herbert Ponting. And so he's giving lectures. He's got his black and white film footage. It's first released and shown to the King of England and the royal family, and then he goes on the lecture circuit. And he's got these great black and white photos, and they're stunning. But revenues from his lectures are 60% below projections and 60% below what they needed to recoup the expenses of the expedition. He even has cute pictures in there to gain public attention and keep the money flowing. There's also pictures for their sponsors. So there's one of them sitting on a case of Heinz baked beans, and another is standing making bread, and there's cans of Cooper's rhubarb. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I wouldn't want to be stuck in the Antarctic for a winter in a small hut like they were with 30 guys eating Heinz's baked beans and Cooper's rhubarb. Doesn't sound like a good idea. But sponsorships were a major part also of Scott's expedition, and they were a major need. Before he left on the depot trip the year before, Scott had a letter typed from Cape Evans to the Huntley Baking Company. They're still in existence, saying, you know, your biscuits are really great. They give us satisfaction, and we're sending back some pictures showing, this is the British spelling of it, your goods in use in Antarctica. And then a long PS. By the way, these things crumble, and it's not so good. These are the same biscuits that don't have any vitamins or other nutrients in them, by the way. But the company still is in existence, and they still have the letter proudly posted on their website. Nobody knows that Scott's dead yet at this point, but the men who remain at Cape Evans suspect that Scott's not going to make it back. There are 13 men left there, and they're looking at a lot of empty bunks. And command of the expedition is passed from Scott to First Lieutenant Evans, who is his second command. But Evans comes back with scurvy and is sent by physician, this gentleman named Dr. Atkinson, to New Zealand to recuperate because his scurvy is so bad. It's ironic that Atkinson is now in charge of the British Antarctic expedition. He's never been in command of anything, even though he's a naval lieutenant. He's a naval doctor, a surgeon. And you know how sometimes fact can be stranger than fiction? I couldn't write this stuff because the actual facts of it are Atkinson's specialty in medicine is tropical parasitic diseases. And here he is in the Antarctic as a physician. And now he's in charge of the British Antarctic expedition. And so for the winter, the science went on, and Atkinson was looking at parasites in seals and Antarctic fish because he doesn't have much to do as a physician because aside from the occasional frostbite, there is no illness in Antarctica, and they're pretty well fed. So they discussed during the winter what they should do, and they decided, let's backtrack along Scott's likely track and see if we can find him and his remains and recover the records at least. And they do so, 158 miles from Cape Evans and 11 miles short of One Ton. But there's disagreements in the journals that his men kept as to what really happened. Silas Wright, who's credited with seeing Scott's last camp first, wrote 20 years after the fact that he saw the tip of the tent sticking about 6 inches above the snow. One of the other people who was there at the time wrote in his journal at the time, I saw a black flagstaff about a half mile off, and then we went over to it. Jerry Gerard writes, we dug down the flagstaff or the bamboo pole, which at first brought us to this place, and it led to the sledge rigged as a mast. Ladies and gentlemen, that bamboo pole is the same one that Scott pulled out of the snow that Amundsen left on the plateau saying, we got here first. Had they not found that, they would have walked right past by a half mile Scott's last location and not found Scott's tent and the records that remain. In the tent, they found 3 bodies, Scott's journals, and a message to the public. Now, Scott's journals had a note written on the back flap saying, these journals may be read by the finder, who he assumed would be a naval officer of the records, but then are to be sealed and returned without anybody else looking at them. But Atkinson, who's running the show at this point, the tropical parasitologist, decided to read the message to the public, to the group of men who were there at the last campsite. And Scott writes, the causes of the disaster are not due to faulty organization, but to misfortune in all things. First, the loss of pony transport obliged me to start later than I had intended. Well, we know from Scott's own journal entries the year earlier that he left on the dates that he had originally planned, and that he followed Shackleton's route and dates exactly, and that he celebrated when he beat Shackleton's record by 2 miles. And Scott writes, the weather was bad. We were delayed by soft snow. Basically, Antarctic conditions were horrible. This is the worst weather that anybody could ever encounter. And these events cut into our provisions because every detail of our food, supplies, clothing, and depots was worked out to perfection. We know from comparing 2 expeditions that left the starting gate on the same dates, basically, faced the same weather, the same conditions, and from what is written by his own men, that this last sentence is not something that all of them necessarily agreed with. They built a mound of snow over the last campsite, erected a cross of skis at the top, and then headed back to Cape Evans, where they erected this more permanent cross with the words of Tennyson, to strive, to seek, and not to yield, along with the names of the 5 men that died with Scott in his attempt to come back. Then they got on the ship and returned to New Zealand. The ship had instructions that when they came back to New Zealand, stay offshore, come in at night, land Scott and 1 other officer in the early morning, but don't tell anybody until they get to the telegraph office and can send the news to London. But they get spotted by a reporter in Christchurch, New Zealand, who writes this brief article that says, Terra Nova arrived in the port at 2 a.m., landed 2 men. We suppose one to be Captain Scott and some other officer, but there's no information available for publication. The local news agent who was engaged by their news syndicate says, no, that's not true. There's nothing, we're not going to say anything. They took Scott's journals and his message to the public. They cabled it from Christchurch, New Zealand, back to London, where the story was released on the afternoon of the 10th. Well, where's Scott on February 10th? Scott is doing a lecture at the Red Gym at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. And this was the advertisement. You can buy reserved seats for 75 cents or $1, general admission for 50 cents. You know, you can get them at this pharmacy. They're on Mifflin Street. They're for sale in Mount Horeb. And they put on extra trains to move people who wanted to go to his lecture from Mount Horeb and Stoughton up to Madison, and some 400 people came from there. The crowd numbers 3,000. And as Amundsen steps off the train here in Wisconsin, he's met with the news. And his reaction is, I'm really not going to say much until I get more details, because the only news that afternoon is they've recovered the records. Scott died on the way back. And Amundsen says to the press, this is horrible, horrible. There must be some mistake about this. The Wisconsin State Journal is relatively pro-Norwegian in this, as you can see from the headlines, including, and I love this piece down here, the little Englishman tried to beat the Norwegian for the honor of being discoverer of the Earth's southern axis. He lost the race, but remained in Antarctica. Chicago Tribune covered Amundsen's lecture here, and this is what their reporter wrote as Amundsen stepped away from the podium, because most of the crowd did not know the story yet, and said, "It is with deepest regret that I begin my lecture tonight." And he called for a moment of silence. And then a crowd of 3,000 people broke out into a storm of applause and cheering for Amundsen because it made his accomplishments all the more fantastic compared to what happened to Scott. On the 11th, the major news is released through Scott's news syndicate all over the world, not just London, not just New York, but all the English-speaking capitals of the world, and also with contractual arrangements with major papers in the capitals of major countries all over the world, from New Delhi to New York to Newcastle. They published Scott's message to the public in its entirety. They had background stories that were put in and waiting for news of Scott. They all ran along with background graphics that had been sent by steamship to press rooms all over the world, just waiting to go. On the 14th, just 3 days later, there's a memorial service that's held in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The King of England is there, members of Parliament, the Admiralty. There are 2,000 invited guests inside St. Paul's Cathedral. There's an 18-page booklet of the memorial service. There are 2 newsreels that are covering the event, and there are 10,000 mourners waiting outside of St. Paul's. This is only a few days after the news was cabled from Christchurch, New Zealand. I'll go over those days. On the 10th of February, the ship arrived at 2 a.m. The first news goes to London. Amundsen is speaking here in Madison. On the 11th, Scott's message to the public is printed in its entirety, along with excerpts from his journal. On the 12th, Scott's ship with the men that were there with him comes back into port. They were told to stay offshore and incommunicado. They dock to a press conference that is orchestrated, and they're not allowed to speak. And then 2 days later, there's this huge memorial service in London. That's where Scott has his advantage. It's on the public relations side, and it's in controlling the story. The London Times would write that it is, that's relative to Scott, it is the temper of men who build empires. And while it lives among us, we shall be capable of maintaining an empire. Scott's son, Peter, wrote the preface to the Diaries of Captain Scott. Those are the handwritten ones that were published in 1968, and you've seen elements of that throughout my presentation this morning. He writes, "It was, after all, the manner of their death that created the legend." Scott was a great writer himself and knew how to write for the public. He wrote in one of his last journal entries, "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale." This is a passage that was memorized by thousands of English school children for many, many years after the event. For Amundsen, success in polar exploration victory awaits for who has everything in order. Some people call it good luck. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions, and in time it's called bad luck. In 1911, 2 men raced to the South Pole. One was first, the other became the hero, but the controversy continues. There are still articles written as to, well, the weather was particularly bad for Scott, and we can prove it by taking a comparison of records. Or maybe the returning parties on Scott's expedition took more from the depots than they should have, and they left Scott to starve. Or maybe the younger men failed, and had they not failed, Scott would have made it. Or had he marched an additional 500 yards every day, he could have made it back safely and would have lived. There is no resolution to it. The handwritten records are kept pretty secure at the Scott Polar Research Institute. It's hard to get access to them. And the debate continues because it's hard to take on a hero once the legend has been crafted. Some sources you might want to look into if you're interested in the story. One of them is The Worst Journey in the World, which actually Cherry Gerard, one of the members of the expedition, wrote. It was published about 11 or 12 years after the events because they kept his press agreement going that long. It is a more full account. An account of Scott's own handwritten journals is found in this version. There's even some footnotes there that have some but not all of the deletions and some but not all of the insertions that were made into Scott's original journal. And then Masterpiece Theater series, The Last Place on Earth, which has been on TV at least twice and is available in video from your library.